The little village of St Mary Mead lay wrapped in the soft grey hush of an October morning. Mist clung to the churchyard yews like forgotten veils, and the air carried the damp, earthy scent of turning leaves and old stone. It was the sort of day when most villagers preferred to stay indoors with a pot of tea and the morning paper. But old Mrs. Martha Ludlow had never been one to let weather keep her from her duties. She had come, as she did every Tuesday, to tend her husband's grave. Her stiff fingers were arranging a small bunch of chrysanthemums when she noticed it, a fresh spray of white lilies lying across the neighbouring headstone. The flowers were dew-kissed and perfect, their petals still tightly cupped. They had not been there yesterday, of that she was certain. The headstone read, "In loving memory of Elizabeth Mary Carstairs, died 12th of October 1951, aged 34 years, rest in peace." Mrs. Ludlow felt a small shiver travel down her spine. Everyone in St Mary Mead knew that grave. Elizabeth Carstairs had been brutally strangled in her own cottage 17 years earlier, and her murderer had never been found. The case had caused a sensation at the time. A beautiful young widow, a missing diamond brooch, whispered affairs, and too many suspects who all seemed to have perfect alibis. The police had eventually given up, and the village had slowly buried the horror beneath layers of everyday life. But now someone had left flowers. By midday the news had spread through the village like smoke from a chimney. In the high street, in the butcher's shop, at the post office, and most particularly in the tea room of Miss Emily's cafe, the topic was discussed in hushed, excited tones. Miss Jane Marple sat by her window that afternoon, her knitting needles clicking steadily. A soft pink shawl was growing beneath her hands, but her mind was far from wool and patterns. Through the lace curtains she could see the churchyard gate, and she had already received 3 visitors bearing the latest details. "White lilies," said Colonel Bantry, pacing her sitting room with his hands behind his back. "Expensive ones too, by the look of them. Who on earth would do such a thing after all these years?" "Guilt, perhaps," murmured Miss Marple gently. "Or remembrance, or something rather more sinister, dear Colonel." Dr. Haydock, who had dropped in for his usual cup of tea, frowned. "It's morbid, that's what it is. Disturbing the dead. Elizabeth Carstairs was a patient of mine. Gentle creature. Didn't deserve what happened to her." Miss Marple's blue eyes remained thoughtful. And yet the murderer was never caught. One does wonder, why flowers now, after 17 long years? That evening, as the church clock struck 6, the vicar's wife, Mrs. Spenlove, arrived in a state of gentle agitation. "Jane, you must come and see for yourself tomorrow. The flowers were still there this afternoon, quite fresh. I can't help feeling it's some sort of sign. Or a warning." Miss Marple smiled her sweet, vague smile. "I think, my dear, I shall take a little walk in the churchyard tomorrow morning. One sees so many interesting things among the graves." The following morning was brighter, with pale sunlight slanting through the yew trees. Miss Marple, wrapped in her best grey coat and carrying a small basket as if she were merely collecting autumn leaves, made her way slowly along the gravel path. She stopped before Elizabeth Carstairs' grave. The lilies were still there, pure white against the weathered grey stone. A small card had been tucked among the stems. On it, written in neat, old-fashioned handwriting, were 4 words, "I have not forgotten." Miss Marple stood very still for a long moment. Then she bent down, not to touch the card, but to examine the damp earth around the grave. There were faint footprints, men's shoes, she thought, but they had been carefully brushed over. She straightened up, her expression gentle but her mind working with the quiet precision of a master clockmaker. "Dear me," she said softly to herself, "this is not simply remorse. This is something quite different." As she turned to leave, she saw a tall, thin figure standing a little way off, watching her. It was Leonard Carstairs, Elizabeth's younger brother. He had returned to the village only 6 months ago after many years in Canada. His face was pale and his eyes held a haunted look that had nothing to do with the autumn chill. "Miss Marple," he said, approaching slowly. "You've heard then?" "Yes, my dear. I was just paying my respects." He looked down at the lilies. 17 years. I hope the past was buried. But someone won't let it stay buried. His voice cracked slightly. "My sister was the kindest person I ever knew. Who could still hate her after all this time?" Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his sleeve. "Hate is not the only reason people return to the graves of those they have harmed, Mr. Carstairs. Sometimes it is love twisted into something terrible. Sometimes it is fear." He stared at her. Fear? She nodded. Fear that the truth is finally beginning to surface. They walked together towards the lich gate. Leonard's shoulders were hunched against more than the cold. "I've been receiving letters," he said suddenly, his voice low. "Anonymous. They started 2 weeks ago. Just one line each time. She knew what you did." Nothing more. I thought it was some cruel joke. But now the flowers. Miss Marple's needles would have clicked faster had she been knitting. Instead, she merely tilted her head. "How very interesting. Have you kept the letters?" He nodded. "Then perhaps, my dear, you might bring them to me this evening. One can sometimes learn a great deal from handwriting and from what is not said." As Leonard Carstairs walked away, Miss Marple stood for a moment longer beneath the ancient yew tree. The church bell began to toll for morning service, but she remained still, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of the quiet churchyard. Somewhere in St. Mary Mead, a murderer was walking free, a murderer who left flowers on the grave of his victim and cryptic messages for the living. The game had begun again after 17 years of silence, and Miss Marple, with her gentle smile and her steel-trap mind, had every intention of playing it to the end. That same evening, as the lamps were lit in Miss Marple's cosy sitting room, Leonard Carstairs arrived precisely at 7:30. He looked like a man carrying a burden too heavy for his thin shoulders. In his hand was a small bundle of envelopes tied with string. Miss Marple received him with her usual gentle courtesy, offering him the winged armchair by the fire and a cup of strong Darjeeling tea. Only after he had taken a few sips did she reach for the letters. There were 7 of them, all posted in St. Mary Mead or the nearby market town of Much Benham. The paper was ordinary, the handwriting careful and old-fashioned, very similar to the card left with the lilies. Each contained a single sentence. "You know what really happened that night. She trusted you, and you betrayed her. The flowers are only the beginning. 17 years is not long enough to forget." Miss Marple studied them for a long time in silence, turning each page to the light, examining the slant of the letters and the pressure of the pen. "Written by someone of education," she murmured at last, "but under considerable emotional strain. Notice how the pen has dug into the paper on certain words. Betrayed, trusted. The writer is not merely accusing Mr. Carstairs. He or she is suffering." Leonard rubbed his forehead. "I've gone over it 1,000 times. Elizabeth and I were close. After our parents died, I was only 20 and she became both sister and mother to me. When she married Richard Carstairs, I was happy for her. He seemed kind enough, though rather older, but after he died in the war, she changed, became quieter. There were rumours, of course." He paused, staring into the fire. Miss Marple waited, her knitting now resting in her lap. "She had a gentleman friend," Leonard continued quietly. "Nothing improper, I'm sure, but people talked. His name was Gerald Hartley, a handsome man, an artist who had come to paint the church. He left the village suddenly 2 days after Elizabeth was killed. The police suspected him, but he had an alibi. He was seen in London that evening." "And the diamond brooch that disappeared?" Miss Marple asked softly. "It was her favourite piece. Richard had given it to her on their wedding day. It was never found. The police thought the murderer took it." Miss Marple folded the letters neatly. "And now someone is reminding you of that night. Tell me, my dear, did your sister ever confide in you about anything that worried her in those last weeks?" Leonard hesitated. A flicker of pain crossed his face. "She said once that she had discovered something unpleasant about someone she trusted. She wouldn't say more. I thought it was village gossip. Now, I wonder." The next morning brought fresh developments. Miss Marple had barely finished her breakfast of boiled egg and toast when the doorbell rang. It was young Inspector Craddock from Much Benham, looking both respectful and slightly exasperated. He had worked with Miss Marple before and knew better than to dismiss her observations. "More flowers, Miss Marple," he said without preamble. "This time pink roses, left sometime during the night. The same handwriting on the card. Forgive me if you can." Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. "Forgive? How very interesting. Not, I cannot forgive, but forgive me. The murderer is asking for something, Inspector. That changes the picture considerably." Together they walked to the churchyard. The new roses lay across the old lilies which were now beginning to wilt at the edges. A small group of villagers had gathered at a respectful distance, Mrs. Ludlow, the vicar's wife, and old Mr. Abbott the verger among them. As Miss Marple and the inspector examined the grave, a woman's voice rang out sharply from behind them. "This is disgraceful! Quite disgraceful!" It was Mrs. Dora Gresham, a large, imposing widow who had been Elizabeth Carstairs' closest friend in the village. Her face was flushed with indignation. Poor Elizabeth has been dead 17 years, and now this mockery! I insist the police put a stop to it at once. Miss Marple turned her mild gaze upon her. "Dear Mrs. Gresham, one cannot help wondering why the murderer has chosen this particular time to remember. Were you and Elizabeth very close in those days?" Mrs. Gresham's expression softened slightly. "Like sisters?" "I was with her only the afternoon before she died. We had tea together. She seemed perfectly happy. A little distracted perhaps, but nothing more." Her voice trembled. "If I had known, if I had stayed longer that evening." There were real tears in her eyes now. Miss Marple patted her arm gently. "Grief is a strange thing, my dear. It can hide for years and then suddenly bloom again like these flowers." Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call on old Miss Emily, who ran the village tea room and knew every piece of gossip worth knowing. Over scones and strawberry jam the conversation flowed. Gerald Hartley was madly in love with her, Miss Emily confided, lowering her voice. Painted her portrait 3 times, but Elizabeth was a respectable widow. She told Dora Gresham she was thinking of ending the friendship because it was causing talk. 2 days later, she was dead. "And the brooch?" Miss Marple asked. "Never seen again. Some say Gerald took it as a keepsake. Others thought it was that sly housemaid, Gladys Brown. She left the village right after the murder and was never heard of again." Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully that evening as she sat by her fire. The human heart was such a complicated thing, she reflected. Love, jealousy, fear, guilt. They twisted together like the roots of the old yew trees in the churchyard. At 9 o'clock there was another knock at her door. This time it was Dr. Haydock, looking unusually grave. "Jane, I've just come from Leonard Carstairs. He's had another letter. This one says, 'The flowers will stop when the truth is told, or when another dies.'" Miss Marple put down her knitting. For the first time, real concern showed in her gentle blue eyes. "Then we have very little time, my dear doctor. The murderer is not merely remembering. He is preparing something. And I fear the next flowers may not be for Elizabeth's grave, but for someone still living." Outside, a soft rain had begun to fall on St. Mary Mead. In the churchyard, the white lilies and pink roses lay together on the cold stone, their petals trembling in the wind. Somewhere in the village, a person who had carried a terrible secret for 17 years was walking the same streets as ordinary decent people, buying bread, nodding good morning, hiding murder behind a smile, and the flowers kept coming. The rain that had begun the previous night continued into the next morning, a steady, whispering drizzle that turned the churchyard paths into glistening ribbons of mud. Miss Marple stood beneath a large black umbrella, her galoshes making soft sucking sounds as she approached Elizabeth Carstairs' grave once more. The flowers had multiplied again. This time it was a delicate bunch of violets, tied with a narrow black ribbon. The card, damp but still legible, bore the words, "The truth hurts more than silence." Inspector Craddock was already there, his coat collar turned up against the weather. "Third day running," he said grimly. "The super is getting impatient. Wants me to post a man here at night, but you know how the chief constable feels about wasting resources on old cases." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the violets. "Violets for faithfulness," she murmured. "Or perhaps for modesty. The murderer is speaking a language of flowers as well as words. How very revealing." They were not alone for long. Leonard Carstairs appeared through the lich gate, his face drawn and eyes red-rimmed from lack of sleep. He carried another envelope. "It came this morning," he said, handing it to Miss Marple. "Pushed under my front door before dawn." The message inside was longer this time. "She discovered your secret, Leonard. The one you thought was safely buried with her. The flowers will continue until you confess what you did." Leonard's hand trembled as he took the letter back. "It's a lie. I swear it. I loved my sister. I would never have harmed her." Miss Marple studied him with deep compassion. "My dear boy, secrets have a way of growing in the dark. Sometimes they belong to us, sometimes they are thrust upon us. Tell me truthfully, was there something your sister knew about you that might have caused her distress?" For a long moment Leonard said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he confessed, "I had debts. Gambling debts from my time in London. Elizabeth found out and paid them quietly to protect the family name. She told me it was the last time, that if I didn't change, she would have to speak to the trustees of our parents' estate. He looked away, ashamed. I was angry with her for a few days, but I never wished her harm. Never. Miss Marple nodded gently. Anger and murder are not the same thing, though many people confuse the two. As they spoke, Mrs. Dora Gresham arrived, dressed in a heavy tweed coat and carrying a basket of flowers intended for her own husband's grave further down the row. When she saw the fresh violets on Elizabeth's stone, her face tightened with unmistakable distress. "More of this nonsense," she exclaimed. "It's turning this churchyard into a circus. Poor Elizabeth deserves better than to be used in someone's twisted game." "Or perhaps," said Miss Marple softly, "it is not a game at all, but a confession that is struggling to be born." Mrs. Gresham gave her a sharp look. "What exactly are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "Nothing yet, my dear. Only that flowers left in secret often say more about the giver than the receiver." Later that morning, Miss Marple accepted an invitation to coffee at the Gresham house, a large, rather gloomy Victorian villa on the edge of the village. The drawing room was filled with heavy furniture and photographs of happier days. One silver-framed photo showed Elizabeth Carstairs and Dora Gresham arm in arm, laughing at a garden party. "She was the dearest friend I ever had," Mrs. Gresham said, her voice catching as she poured the coffee. "After my husband died, Elizabeth helped me through the worst of it. We shared everything, or so I thought." Miss Marple noticed a slight hesitation. "And yet," Dora set the silver coffee pot down with a small clatter, "there was one thing she wouldn't tell me. In the week before she died, she said she had made a terrible discovery. Something that changed how she saw someone very close to her. She seemed frightened, Jane, truly frightened. I begged her to confide in me, but she only said, 'Some truths are too dangerous to share, even with those we love most.'" The older woman's eyes filled with tears. "If only I'd pressed her harder. If only I'd stayed with her that last evening instead of going home early." Miss Marple reached out and touched her hand. "We all carry our small regrets, my dear. The important thing is not to let them blind us to the truth now." In the afternoon, Miss Marple made her way to the cottage where Gladys Brown, the former housemaid, had once lived. It was now occupied by a young couple, but the present tenant remembered hearing stories from the previous owner. "Gladys left in a terrible hurry," the young woman told her. "Packed her things the very morning after the murder and caught the first train to London. Never even collected her last week's wages." Miss Marple's mind was busy as she walked home through the wet lanes. The human heart was capable of such extraordinary contradictions. Love and hatred living side by side, loyalty and betrayal tangled like ivy on an old wall. That evening, as she sat knitting by the fire, Dr. Haydock came to call again. "Another letter has come," he said without greeting. "This one was addressed to me of all people. It says, 'Ask Miss Marple why she thinks the brooch was never found. She may be closer to the truth than she realises.'" Miss Marple's needles paused. "How very bold. The murderer is watching us, Doctor, and becoming impatient." Haydock frowned. "This is getting dangerous, Jane. I don't like it. A killer who has stayed silent for 17 years doesn't suddenly start sending flowers and letters unless something has changed. Something that has frightened him into action. Or her," Miss Marple corrected gently. "We must not forget that possibility." The church clock struck 10 as the doctor left. Miss Marple remained by the fire a long time, her gentle face thoughtful. She was thinking of white lilies for purity, pink roses for gratitude, violets for faithfulness, and of a diamond brooch that had vanished on the night of a murder. Outside, the rain had eased, but a cold wind moved through the yew trees in the churchyard. On Elizabeth Carstairs' grave, the violets lay trembling slightly, as if touched by an invisible hand. In the darkness of St. Mary Mead, someone moved quietly between the cottages. Someone who remembered every detail of that October night 17 years ago. Someone who could no longer bear the weight of what they had done, or what they knew. Miss Marple closed her eyes for a moment and whispered to herself, "The flowers are not for the dead. They are for the living. And soon, I fear, there will be fresh ones." Far away in the village, a light burned late in one window. Another letter was being written, the pen pressing hard into the paper, the hand shaking with long suppressed emotion. The game of remembrance had become a game of deadly revelation. The fourth morning dawned crisp and clear, as though the village itself were holding its breath. Miss Marple rose early, her mind still turning over the curious language of flowers and the sharper language of anonymous letters. She had scarcely finished her breakfast when young Tommy Simmons, the vicar's nephew, came running up her garden path, cheeks flushed with excitement. "Miss Marple, more flowers! And this time there's a proper bouquet. White roses and forget-me-nots. Inspector Craddock says you should come quick." She needed no second invitation. Pulling on her coat and tying a woolen scarf about her silver hair, she walked briskly to the churchyard. A small crowd had already gathered at a respectful distance. The new flowers lay arranged with almost loving care across the grave, their blue and white petals glowing against the grey stone. The card, written in the same neat hand, read simply, "For all the years I stole from you." Inspector Craddock looked troubled. "This is escalating, Miss Marple. The Chief Constable wants results. He's talking about bringing in Scotland Yard if we don't make progress soon." Miss Marple bent to examine the arrangement. White roses for innocence, or for silence. Forget-me-nots for remembrance. Our murderer has a poetic soul, Inspector, and a guilty one. Leonard Carstairs stood a little apart, staring at the flowers with something like horror. When Miss Marple approached him, he spoke in a low, strained voice. "I hardly slept. Every time I close my eyes, I see Elizabeth's face the last time I saw her alive. She looked at me with such disappointment when she paid those debts. I told myself I'd make it up to her, but I never got the chance." There was raw pain in his eyes, the kind that comes from long-buried regret. Miss Marple felt a genuine pang of sympathy for the man. Life had a way of punishing people long after their mistakes, she thought. "Secrets are heavy things to carry alone, my dear," she said kindly. "Perhaps it is time to lay yours down." Before he could reply, Mrs. Dora Gresham swept into the churchyard like a ship in full sail, her face pale and her mouth set in a hard line. She stopped short at the sight of the fresh flowers. "This has gone too far," she declared loudly. "It's harassment of the dead. I shall speak to the bishop myself if necessary." Yet beneath the indignation, Miss Marple detected something else, a flicker of fear in the woman's usually commanding eyes. "Dear Mrs. Gresham," Miss Marple said gently, drawing her aside, "you and Elizabeth were so very close. Did she ever mention a diamond brooch in any special way during those last days?" Dora hesitated, her gloved hands tightening on her handbag. The brooch. It was her most treasured possession. Richard gave it to her. She wore it often. The night before she died, she told me she might have to sell it to help someone. She wouldn't say who. I assumed it was Leonard and his wretched gambling. She glanced quickly at Leonard, then looked away. But perhaps I was wrong. Miss Marple noted the quick glance. Human relationships were so delicately balanced, she reflected. One small suspicion could tilt them forever. That afternoon she paid a quiet visit to the home of old Mr. Abbott, the verger, who had been responsible for locking the churchyard gates for 30 years. "Never seen anything like it in all my days," he grumbled over a glass of sherry. "Flowers appearing like magic. Gates are locked at dusk, mind you, but there's the little side gate near the yews that doesn't close properly. A child could slip through." Miss Marple's eyes brightened. How very convenient for someone who wishes to come and go unseen. Later, over tea at the vicarage, the vicar's wife confided in her with genuine worry. "Jane, the whole village is on edge. People are remembering things they'd rather forget. Mrs. Price was in the post office saying she always thought Gerald Hartley was innocent, that he was too gentle to strangle anyone. And then there's talk about Gladys Brown again. Some say she stole the brooch and ran away with it." Miss Marple smiled her vague little smile. "So many theories, my dear, and yet only one truth." As evening fell, a telegram arrived at Miss Marple's cottage. It was from an old acquaintance in London who had once helped her trace missing persons. It read, "Gladys Brown traced. Now Mrs. Gladys Merton. Lives in Much Benham. Works at hospital. Willing to speak tomorrow morning." Miss Marple felt a quiet thrill of satisfaction. Pieces were slowly moving into place. The next morning, she and Inspector Craddock drove together to Much Benham. Gladys Merton, formerly Brown, was a thin, anxious-looking woman in her late 40s. She met them in the small parlour of her modest terraced house, twisting a handkerchief between her fingers. "I knew someone would come eventually," she said in a tired voice. When I heard about the flowers, I thought, it's starting again. She took a deep breath. I didn't steal the brooch, though God knows I was tempted. Mrs. Carstairs was kind to me, but the night she was killed, I saw something. Mr. Gerald Hartley leaving by the back gate looking terrible upset, and later, much later, I saw Mrs. Gresham slipping out of the cottage. It was past 11. She didn't see me. Miss Marple leaned forward, her blue eyes keen. And did you tell the police at the time? Gladys shook her head, ashamed. I was scared. I'd taken a small silver spoon once. Nothing much, but I thought they'd blame me for everything. So I ran. I've lived with that guilt for 17 years. There were tears in her eyes now, genuine human tears of regret and long-carried fear. On the drive back to St Mary Mead, Inspector Craddock was thoughtful. Dora Gresham? She always seemed the most devoted friend. Devotion can twist into something ugly when jealousy or money enters the picture, Miss Marple replied softly. We must be very careful now, Inspector. The murderer feels the net tightening. That makes them dangerous. When they reached the village, Sian, a new shock awaited them. Another letter had been delivered, this time to Miss Marple herself. It lay on her doormat, written in the familiar hand. You're getting too close, dear lady. Stop now, or the next flowers will be for a different grave, one that is still empty. Miss Marple read it twice, then folded it carefully. For the first time in many days, a shadow of real concern crossed her gentle face. That night, as rain began to fall once more on the churchyard, someone stood silently before Elizabeth Carstairs' grave. The figure placed a single red rose, the flower of passion and danger, directly beneath the headstone. No card this time, only the blood-red bloom glistening with raindrops. In her warm cottage, Miss Marple sat by the fire, knitting steadily, but her mind was far away. She was thinking of friendship, betrayal, a missing brooch, and a murderer who could no longer stay silent. The past had awakened, and it was demanding its due. The single red rose lay like a drop of fresh blood against the weathered stone. By the time Miss Marple reached the churchyard the following morning, a thin mist was rising from the damp grass, giving the place an unearthly stillness. Inspector Craddock stood beside the grave with his hands deep in his pockets, his expression grim. No card this time, he said. Just the rose, left sometime after midnight. The ground's too wet for clear footprints. Miss Marple gazed at the solitary flower for a long moment. Red for passion, red for blood, red for warning. Her voice was quiet, almost sad. Our murderer is growing desperate. The messages have changed from guilt to threat. She turned as Leonard Carstairs approached slowly, his face haggard and unshaven. He looked like a man who had aged 10 years in 4 days. I received another letter this morning, he said hoarsely, holding out a crumpled envelope. It says I have until tomorrow night to confess everything publicly, or the whole village will learn what I really did to my sister. His voice broke on the last words. There were tears in his eyes, not theatrical, but the quiet, ashamed tears of a man who had disappointed the one person who had always believed in him. Miss Marple touched his arm with genuine tenderness. My dear, carrying guilt is a terrible burden, but sometimes the guilt we imagine is heavier than the sin itself. Come, walk with me a little. They moved along the gravel path between the old tombs. Leonard spoke haltingly, revealing fragments of his life that he had never shared before. How his gambling had spiraled after the war, how Elizabeth had quietly saved him twice, and how he had felt both grateful and resentful at her gentle lectures. She was the only one who truly loved me, he whispered, and I let her down. Further along the path they met Dora Gresham coming the opposite way. She stopped abruptly when she saw the red rose. For a second her strong face crumpled, revealing raw grief beneath the usual commanding mask. I can't bear this anymore, she said, her voice trembling. Elizabeth was my dearest friend. We shared secrets, laughter, even our sorrows after our husbands died. Why is someone doing this to her memory? Shh, to us? Miss Marple studied her carefully. There was real pain in Dora's eyes, but also something guarded, like a door half closed against unwelcome light. Perhaps, my dear, the murderer is not trying to dishonour her memory, Miss Marple suggested gently, but to finally honour it by bringing out the truth. Sometimes love and guilt wear the same face. Dora's cheeks flushed. What are you implying, Jane? That I had something to do with this horror? I imply nothing yet, Miss Marple replied calmly, but I do wonder why you visited Elizabeth so late that final evening. Gladys Brown saw you leaving after 11 o'clock. The effect was immediate. Dora's hands tightened on her umbrella until the knuckles showed white. For a long moment she said nothing, then the words came in a rush, full of emotion. Yes, I was there. Elizabeth had asked me to come. She was in great distress. She had found out that Gerald Hartley had been stealing small sums from her. Painting money she gave him for supplies. She was planning to end the friendship that night. She showed me the diamond brooch and said she might sell it to cover what he had taken so no scandal would touch the family name. Dora's eyes filled with tears. I begged her not to see him alone. I offered to stay, but she insisted she could handle it. If only I had been more forceful. Her voice broke completely. She turned away, shoulders shaking with quiet sobs, the deep, honest weeping of someone who had carried regret for 17 long years. Miss Marple's heart ached for her. Human frailty was so very real, she thought. People made mistakes, hid truths, and then suffered alone in silence. That afternoon, Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock drove once more to Much Benham to speak with Gladys Merton again. The former housemaid seemed even more nervous this time. I've remembered something else, she said, twisting her hands. On the day Mrs. Carstairs died, I found the diamond brooch hidden in the back of a drawer in the writing desk, not in her jewellery box where she usually kept it. It looked as though she had put it there in a hurry, and there was a letter with it, half written. It was addressed to Mr. Hartley. I only saw the beginning. My dear Gerald, I have discovered... Before Mrs. Carstairs came in and quickly put it away. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened. And you never mentioned this to the police. I was frightened, Gladys admitted, shame colouring her voice. I thought they'd say I was trying to shift blame. So I ran away instead. I've regretted it every single day since. There was such genuine remorse in the woman's face that Miss Marple believed her completely. Another human soul burdened by a decision made in fear. Back in St Mary Mead, the atmosphere had grown noticeably tense. People spoke in low voices in the shops. Children were called home earlier. Even the usual cheerful greetings at the post office had an edge of unease. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her sitting room with her knitting. But the pink shawl had grown very little. Her mind was elsewhere. She was thinking of half-finished letters, hidden brooches, late-night visits, and a red rose that spoke of danger. At 7:30, Dr. Haydock arrived, looking unusually serious. Another letter has been delivered, Jane. This one was pushed under my door too. And it says, Miss Marple should look at the old summer house behind the Carstairs cottage. What is buried there may surprise her, but she had better hurry. Time is running out. Miss Marple put down her knitting at once. Then we must go tonight, Doctor, with the inspector, of course. The old summer house stood at the bottom of the garden of what was once Elizabeth Carstairs' cottage, now occupied by newcomers who rarely used the overgrown grounds. With torches and the inspector's lamp, they carefully searched the small wooden structure. It was Miss Marple who noticed the loose floorboard in the corner. Beneath it, wrapped in oilcloth, they found a small metal box. Inside lay the missing diamond brooch, still sparkling, and a folded letter dated the day of the murder. The letter in Elizabeth's neat hand read, My dearest Dora, I have discovered the truth about the money. It was never Gerald. It was you. I know you took it because you were desperate after your husband's debts. I forgive you, but I cannot keep silent any longer. We must talk tonight. Please come at 9. Your loving friend, Elizabeth. No one spoke for a long moment. The discovery hung heavy in the damp air. So Dora Gresham had the strongest motive, Inspector Craddock said quietly. Jealousy over Gerald, fear of exposure, and the theft of money from her closest friend. Miss Marple looked troubled, her gentle face shadowed. It would seem so, and yet, something does not feel quite right. The human heart is rarely so straightforward. As they left the summer house, a sudden rustle in the bushes made them turn. A figure fled into the darkness. Inspector Craddock gave chase but returned empty-handed. Whoever had been watching had escaped. That night, as Miss Marple prepared for bed, another envelope was pushed under her front door. The message inside was short and chilling. You have found the brooch. Now stop or the next grave will be yours. The flowers are ready. She stood by the window for a long time, looking out into the quiet village street. Somewhere out there, a murderer was watching and waiting, a person capable of both tenderness and terrible violence. The past had finally demanded payment, and St Mary Mead was no longer the peaceful place it had always seemed. The discovery of the diamond brooch and Elizabeth's unfinished letter spread through St Mary Mead like a cold autumn wind. By breakfast time the next morning, the village hummed with whispered conversations and sideways glances. Miss Marple, seated at her window with a cup of tea, watched the passing figures with her usual gentle expression, though her mind was working with quiet precision. Inspector Craddock arrived at 9 o'clock sharp, looking tired and determined. "We've brought Dora Gresham in for questioning," he said without preamble. "She denies everything, of course, claims she never received any such letter from Elizabeth and that the brooch must have been planted. But the evidence is damning, Miss Marple. Motive, opportunity, and now this." Miss Marple set her teacup down carefully. "And yet, my dear Inspector, I find myself uneasy. The human heart is not always so tidy, while one moment of desperation does not necessarily make a murderer." They walked together to the police station in Much Benham. Dora Gresham sat in the small interview room, her usually imposing figure now somehow smaller. Her eyes were red from crying, but she held her head high with stubborn dignity. "I did take money from Elizabeth," she admitted in a low, broken voice. "Not much at first. My husband left me with terrible debts. I was ashamed. Elizabeth found out and forgave me, she truly did. She said we would find a way together. That letter you found. Yes, she wrote it. But I swear I never saw it. I went to her cottage that night at 9, just as she asked. The door was unlocked. I called out, but there was no answer. Then I saw her, lying there on the drawing room floor." Dora's voice cracked completely. Fresh tears rolled down her cheeks. "I panicked. I thought if I was found there, they would blame me. So I ran. I have lived with that cowardice every single day for 17 years, but I did not kill her. I loved her like a sister." There was such raw, painful honesty in her words that Miss Marple felt a deep wave of pity. She leaned forward and spoke gently. "My dear, fear makes us do terrible things, but sometimes the greatest fear is not of punishment, but of losing the love we cherish most." Dora looked at her with exhausted eyes. "Then help me, Jane. Someone is using Elizabeth's death to destroy us all." As they left the station, Leonard Carstairs was waiting outside, pacing anxiously. He approached Miss Marple at once. "I've been thinking all night," he said. "What if the murderer is Gerald Hartley? He disappeared right after the killing. Perhaps he came back. Perhaps the flowers are his way of trying to shift blame onto the rest of us." Miss Marple regarded him kindly. "And yet the letters accuse you specifically, my dear. The murderer seems very interested in your guilt." Leonard flushed. "I've told you everything about the gambling. There is nothing more. Elizabeth was the only one who knew how weak I was. She protected me until the end." The afternoon brought yet another floral offering to the grave, this time a small posy of white carnations and myrtle. The card read, "Truth will out, no more hiding." The village was now openly unsettled. In Miss Emily's tea room, conversation stopped whenever anyone new entered. Old grudges were being remembered. Mrs. Price insisted she had always known there was something funny about that Gresham woman. The butcher's wife whispered that Leonard had never been quite right since Canada. Miss Marple spent the latter part of the afternoon in her garden, ostensibly pruning her roses but really turning the facts over in her mind. The flowers spoke of remorse. The letters spoke of accusation and fear. The brooch had been hidden carefully, as though Elizabeth herself had wanted it kept safe. And the summer house? Why there, of all places? At tea time, Dr. Haydock dropped in, looking unusually grave. "Gerald Hartley has been traced," he announced, "living quietly in a small village in Kent. He agrees to come tomorrow to speak with us. Says he has nothing to hide." Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily. How very interesting. After 17 years. Like everyone is suddenly willing to talk. The flowers have stirred the waters deeply. That evening, as twilight settled over St Mary Mead, Miss Marple decided to take a solitary walk. The churchyard was empty except for the verger, who tipped his hat and moved away respectfully. She stood before Elizabeth's grave for a long time. The new carnations looked pure and innocent in the fading light. "Dear Elizabeth," she whispered softly, "you tried to protect everyone, didn't you? Even the one who betrayed you most." A sudden footstep on the gravel made her turn. Gerald Hartley stood there, older, greyer, but still possessing the sensitive face of an artist. He looked at the grave with profound sadness. I loved her, he said simply, not in any scandalous way. She was kind and beautiful and she understood my work. I never took a penny from her. When she told me she had to end our friendship because of village gossip, I was heartbroken, but I respected her wishes. I left for London that same afternoon. I never saw her alive again. There were tears in the man's eyes. Quiet, masculine tears held back for nearly 2 decades. Miss Marple studied him with deep compassion. And the brooch, Mr. Hartley? I knew nothing about it until now. Elizabeth once showed it to me and said it represented everything good in her marriage. She would never have sold it lightly. They spoke for nearly half an hour. By the end, Miss Marple was more puzzled than ever. Gerald Hartley's grief seemed completely genuine. As she walked home through the gathering darkness, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck, the distinct sensation of being watched. She paused near the lich gate and turned quickly, but saw only shadows. Later that night, as she sat by her fire trying to knit, another envelope was pushed under her door. The message was shorter and more menacing than before. You have dug up the past. Now it will bury you. Tomorrow night the flowers will be for the living. Stay away from the grave. Miss Marple read it twice, then placed it carefully with the others. Her gentle face showed real concern now. The murderer was no longer playing a game of remembrance. The game had become deadly serious. Outside, a soft wind moved through the yew trees. On Elizabeth Carstairs' grave, the white carnation stirred slightly. Somewhere in the sleeping village, someone lay awake, hands perhaps still stained with the memory of strangling a dear friend 17 years ago, and now preparing to strike again to protect their secret. Miss Marple extinguished her lamp but did not sleep for a long time. She was thinking of friendship, money, jealousy, protection, and the terrible things people do when they feel cornered. The final act was approaching, and in St. Mary Mead, no one was truly safe anymore. The tension in St. Mary Mead had become almost palpable by the following morning. It hung in the air like the heavy mist that refused to lift from the meadows. Villagers went about their business with hurried steps and lowered voices, casting suspicious glances at neighbours they had known for decades. The churchyard, once a place of peaceful reflection, now felt like the centre of a gathering storm. Miss Marple arrived early, her knitting bag over her arm as though it were any ordinary day. The latest flowers, a wreath of white lilies and dark cypress, lay across Elizabeth Carstairs' grave like a funeral offering. The card, written in the familiar precise hand, carried a final, chilling message. It ends tonight, one way or another. Inspector Craddock was already there, his face etched with worry. We've increased patrols, but the Chief Constable still thinks this is some macabre prank. I disagree. After that threat to you last night, Miss Marple, I'm taking no chances. Before she could reply, rapid footsteps approached. Dora Gresham came hurrying down the path, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. She stopped before the grave, staring at the new wreath as though it were a personal accusation. I didn't sleep, she said hoarsely. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Elizabeth's face. I keep thinking, perhaps I did kill her. Perhaps in my desperation I lost my mind for a moment and then blocked it out. Her voice broke into a sob, but I know I didn't. I loved her. She was the only real friend I had left in this world. There was such raw anguish in her words that even the inspector looked moved. Miss Marple took the larger woman's hand in her own small, gentle one. My dear Dora, the mind plays cruel tricks when guilt and fear walk hand in hand. But true murder leaves a different mark, colder, more calculated. You are suffering, but I do not believe you are a killer. Leonard Carstairs appeared shortly after, looking utterly exhausted. Dark circles lay beneath his eyes. I've decided, he announced quietly. Tonight at 8 o'clock in the village hall I will speak. I will tell everything. The gambling, the arguments with Elizabeth, the letters. If that is what the murderer wants, then let it be done. Perhaps then the flowers will stop and we can all have peace. Miss Marple studied him with deep compassion. That is a brave thing you are doing, my dear. Facing one's weaknesses in public is harder than most people ever realise. Gerald Hartley arrived in the village just before noon. He looked older than his years, his artist's hands trembling slightly as he placed a single yellow rose on the grave, the flower of friendship and farewell. I should have come back years ago, he said to Miss Marple when they spoke privately in her sitting room later that afternoon. I ran because I was afraid they would blame me. I was in love with her, you see, quietly, hopelessly. When she said she had to end our meetings, it broke something in me. But I swear on my soul I never harmed her. His voice carried the quiet pain of a man who had carried unrequited love like a wound for 17 years. Miss Marple listened with genuine sympathy, noting how his eyes filled when he spoke Elizabeth's name. The afternoon brought one more disturbing discovery. Young Tommy Simons, playing near the old summer house, found a small rusted garden trowel, buried shallowly in the soft earth. On its handle were faint dark stains that looked suspiciously like dried blood. It was sent at once to the laboratory in Much Benham. Miss Marple sat by her window that evening as the light faded, her knitting forgotten in her lap. The pink shawl lay half finished, a symbol, perhaps, of how incomplete everything still felt. She thought of all the human emotions that had surfaced in the past week. Leonard's shame, Dora's desperate regret, Gerald's lingering love, Gladys's long-carried fear. Each person had shown a different face of grief and guilt. At 7:30, Dr. Haydock came to escort her to the village hall. "I don't like this, Jane," he said gruffly. "Too many people with too many secrets in one room. Feels like a powder keg." The hall was already crowded when they arrived. Nearly the entire village had turned out. Leonard stood at the front, pale but determined. Dora Gresham sat in the second row, twisting a handkerchief. Gerald Hartley stood at the back, watching silently. Leonard began to speak in a voice that grew stronger as he went on. He spoke of his gambling debts, of Elizabeth's loving but firm interventions, of his resentment and his deep regret. "I was weak," he said, tears shining in his eyes, "but I did not kill my sister. I would have given my own life to save hers." A murmur ran through the hall, then Dora rose unsteadily to her feet. "I too have something to confess," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "I took money from Elizabeth. I was there the night she died. I found her body and I ran away like a coward. But I swear before God I did not kill her." The atmosphere was electric. Miss Marple sat very still, her sharp eyes moving from face to face, reading the emotions playing across them: shock, relief, suspicion, sorrow. Suddenly the door at the back of the hall opened with a loud creak. Gladys Merton stepped inside, her face white. "I can't stay silent any longer," she cried. "I saw who left the flowers last night." "It was—" A sharp scream cut her off. Mrs. Ludlow, who had been sitting near the front, suddenly clutched her chest and collapsed forward. In the chaos that followed, no one noticed at first the small bunch of purple foxgloves that had fallen from her lap onto the floor, the same flowers known to be poisonous in the wrong hands. Dr. Haydock rushed to her side. "She's been poisoned!" he shouted. In the confusion, Miss Marple moved quickly through the crowd. Her gentle face was now set with purpose. She reached Mrs. Ludlow and picked up the fallen foxgloves, examining them carefully. "Dear me," she said softly, almost to herself. "How very clever, and how very sad." Inspector Craddock was at her side instantly. "What is it, Miss Marple?" She looked up, her blue eyes clear and sorrowful. "The murderer has made their final move. But they have made one small mistake. A very human mistake born of panic." Outside, the church clock began to strike 8. The flowers on Elizabeth's grave were waiting for one last visitor, the person who had tended them with such twisted devotion for the past week. Miss Marple turned to the inspector. "We must go to the churchyard now, quickly. I believe the final truth is about to reveal itself, and it will be more tragic than any of us imagined." As they hurried through the darkened streets, a light rain began to fall. In the village hall behind them, voices rose in confusion and fear. 17 years of silence had finally shattered, but the price had been terribly high. Miss Marple walked with surprising speed for her age, her mind clear and her heart heavy. The murderer had left flowers out of guilt, out of love. He's out of a desperate need for forgiveness that had twisted into something monstrous. Now, at last, the end was near. The rain fell softly as Miss Marple and Inspector Craddock reached the churchyard. The ancient yew trees stood like silent guardians, their branches heavy with moisture. A single lantern burned near the lich gate, casting long, trembling shadows across the graves. Elizabeth Carstairs' tombstone gleamed wetly, covered now with a final, elaborate arrangement of white lilies, red roses, and purple foxgloves. the same deadly flowers that had nearly killed Mrs. Ludlow. They were not alone. Mrs. Martha Ludlow stood motionless before the grave, her old shoulders hunched beneath a dark shawl. In her gloved hands she held one last small bunch of violets. When she heard their footsteps, she turned slowly. There were no tears on her face, only an infinite, exhausted sadness. "I knew you would come, Miss Marple," she said quietly. Her voice was steady, almost gentle. "You always see what others miss." Inspector Craddock stepped forward, but Miss Marple raised a hand to stop him. She approached the old woman with the same kindness she would show to any troubled neighbour. "My dear Martha," she said softly, "you have carried this burden for 17 years. It is time to set it down." Mrs. Ludlow looked at the grave for a long moment, then gently placed the violets among the other flowers. "I didn't mean to kill her," she whispered. "Not at first. I only wanted to speak to her." The words came slowly at first, then in a quiet flood, full of the raw pain of a human soul that had broken long ago. "Elizabeth was my daughter," she said. The silence that followed was absolute, broken only by the soft patter of rain on leaves. Miss Marple nodded gently, as if she had already guessed. "Yes, I began to suspect when I saw how personally you tended this grave all these years, and how the handwriting on the cards matched the old letters you once wrote to the vicar about church flowers." Mrs. Ludlow gave a small, broken smile. "She never knew. I gave her up when she was born. I was young, unmarried, and terrified. She was adopted by the Carstairs family and grew up believing they were her parents. When I moved to St. Mary Mead after my husband died, I only wanted to be near her, to watch her from afar. She was so beautiful, so kind, just like I had imagined." Her voice trembled. "Then one day she found some old papers in her father's desk. She came to me. She had guessed the truth. She was so happy to find her real mother. We met in secret for weeks. She called me mother in private. It was the happiest time of my life." Tears finally came, sliding silently down the old woman's wrinkled cheeks. "But then she discovered the money I had taken from Dora over the years. Small amounts, but many of them. I was desperate after my husband's long illness. Elizabeth was shocked. She said she would have to tell Dora everything. She was going to expose me to protect her friend. I went to her cottage that night to beg her not to. We argued. She became angry. She said she'd been wrong about me, that blood meant nothing if there was no trust." Mrs. Ludlow's hands shook as she clutched the edge of the headstone. "I don't remember picking up the silk scarf. It's just I only remember my hands pulling it tight around her neck. When I realised what I had done, it was too late. I took the brooch because it had her initials on it. I wanted something of hers. I hid it in the summer house where we used to meet secretly. Then I ran." She looked at Miss Marple with eyes full of 17 years of torment. "Every year on the anniversary I left flowers. Just one bunch. Quietly. This year, I don't know what happened. The guilt became too loud. I needed someone to know. I needed her to forgive me. So I started leaving more. The letters were for Leonard because I knew he had disappointed her. I thought if he confessed his own sins, perhaps mine would feel lighter. It was madness. All of it." Inspector Craddock stood very still, rain dripping from his hat. Even he looked moved by the quiet devastation in the old woman's voice. Miss Marple spoke with deep compassion. "You loved her in the only way you knew how, from a distance, then too closely. Love and fear twisted together until they became something terrible. The flowers were both an apology and a cry for help." Mrs. Ludlow nodded slowly. "When you found the brooch and the letter, I knew it was ending. I tried to frighten you away. I even put the foxgloves in Mrs. Ludlow's, in my own, lap at the meeting to create confusion. A last desperate attempt. But I am tired, Miss Marple. So very tired." She looked once more at the grave and whispered, "Forgive me, my darling girl. I only wanted to be your mother." Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on the old woman's shoulder. In that moment there was no triumph, and only the quiet sorrow of understanding human frailty. The following morning the churchyard was quiet once more. The flowers had been removed, but a single bunch of fresh white roses lay on Elizabeth's grave, placed there by Miss Marple herself. Leonard Carstairs stood beside her, looking years younger now that the weight of false accusation had lifted. "I shall never be the man she hoped I would be," he said quietly, "but I can try to live better in her memory." Dora Gresham approached slowly. She and Leonard exchanged a long look. Two people forever changed by the same tragedy. Then, surprisingly, Dora reached out and squeezed his hand. "We both failed her in different ways," she said. "Perhaps we can honour her by being kinder to each other." Gerald Hartley had already left the village at dawn, but he had left behind a small painting of Elizabeth as a young woman, smiling beneath the apple trees. It now hung in the vicarage. Miss Marple walked home slowly through the lanes she had known for so many years. The pink shawl was finished at last and lay neatly folded in her basket. Later that evening, as she sat by her fire with Dr. Haydock, she spoke softly. "The saddest murders, my dear doctor, are not those done for greed or hatred, but those born from a love that was never allowed to grow naturally. Martha Ludlow killed the one person she had waited her whole life to love." She picked up her knitting once more, a new piece, soft blue this time. "We are all such fragile creatures," she murmured, "capable of both great goodness and terrible mistakes. The important thing is to be kind while we still can." Outside, the church bells rang softly across St. Mary Mead. The village settled back into its peaceful rhythm, though some scars would remain. On Elizabeth Carstairs' grave, the wind gently stirred the petals of the white roses. And somewhere, in a quiet cell, an old woman sat with a small bunch of violets given to her by a compassionate police matron, whispering the same words she had written so many times. "I have not forgotten.